This is what your comic will look like. Episode 2 is out and man, that took a while to produce. Mostly because I juggle between my duties as the director of the studio and my main job, so recording and editing can only be done in so much time. Anyhow, go check the first 2 episodes if you haven't already. You good? Okay, let's get back to business. In the first episode we covered concept and planning. In the second episode we covered scripting and character design, which means that we get to the juicy parts, which are penciling, inking, and coloring. The first thing that we're going to need is a way for us to illustrate our comic. There are many ways to go about this, and trust me, there's no right or wrong answers. As you may or may not know, there's a traditional way of illustrating a comic book and the modern way of doing it. Whether you choose to do it traditionally or digitally, it is entirely your choice. Choose what you feel will best represent the story you want to tell. For all I know, you can make a comic book on a rock wall. Just be creative and explore new ideas if you feel you can tell a great story by doing so. But for the sake of showcasing how we made our comic book, we will go with the modern digital route. Nonetheless, all the steps shown can be replicated, although with minor differences on the traditional way of illustrating a comic. Since we're going with the digital route, we're gonna use a digital illustration program. There are many options available. They go from free apps to trials to subscription-based and paid apps. Originally, we were gonna use For Alpaca, and for all I know, the app will be able to deliver just as good as any other app. Upon the recommendation of fellow artist and friend Tilly, we moved from For Alpaca to Clip Studio. I would argue that the difference between Clip Studio and For Alpaca is the way in which tools are presented. In Clip, the tools are basically ready to use and you must make some minor tweaks here and there that will adapt to your needs. For Alpaca, on the other hand, tools are basically created by you. Let me show you. Something you'll notice is how different the interface is, and for that matter, your layout and workspace. If you want to save a few bucks, then go for Alpaca. If you can spend a few dollars on a program that allows you to work on your project at a faster rate, then go with Clip Studio. Here is where you must value not only your resources but your time as well. With that being said, we must determine the dimensions in which our comic will be presented. How do you go about this, you may ask? And well, it depends. It depends on how you want to present your comic. Like I said before, there's no right or wrong answers as long as it feels right for you. The only recommendation I could give you is that if you're going to print your comic book, you should check with your printing provider to see if the dimensions you're giving them are okay or if you'll need to modify them to avoid complications. If you're only going digital, check the dimensions available for your hosting provider. And well, let's get started then. If you're going digital like us and you're using Clip Studio, these are the settings we're using. First, you will need to download Clip Studio if you haven't already. Once you have installed it, you will have to make some adjustments. The first thing you'll notice is the setting called Project. Click on the 5th tab. That is the custom project settings. The first one is Illustration. Then we have Webtoon. On the 3rd tab, we have Comic. After that comes in Printing and Fanzine. Then we have Custom Project. And finally, we have Animation. Yeah, Clip is a robust app in that sense. So like I said, here is where you must value not only your resources but your time as well. In File Name, you basically name your project. Given that we're working on a volume of 10 issues, we have name-coded the name of our project files. First goes the name of the volume, then we have the number of the issue. In this case, it is The Legend Reborn followed by the issue's number. The Legend Reborn Issue 2. The third thing you'll notice is the Save to File setting. This is a location in which Clip stores your files and saves them in your documents. Finally, you have your presets. Here you will find all sorts of dimensions used in the industry. Those were your general project settings. Now we're going to check these 7 specific settings. We have Canvas, Comic settings, setting for fanzine, multiple pages, cover page, store information, and folio. Of these we only care about 4. Canvas, Comic settings, multiple pages, and cover page. In Canvas we work on the overall design of the pages. The settings I go with are 10 inches for the width and 14 inches for the height. The resolution I prefer is 1200 dpi because we're sending virtual copies of the comic to our backers, but most printing providers won't do anything beyond 600 dpi. Regardless, check with your printing provider first. The next thing we want to check are the comic settings. Once again, the same as above applies. Here are the settings I work with, but check with your provider for the final product. The following setting we need to tweak is multiple pages. As you see, 4 of these pages are the cover pages, plus 20 body pages. Never use odd numbers if you're going to print your book. It is impossible to print a book with odd numbers. The binding point is where the book will be stitched and from what side readers will see it. Manga and manhwa are the only forms of comics which are read from right to left. Finally, we have cover page. The name is pretty much self-explanatory. In this setting, we design the cover art for the comic. When working on a digital comic, you should select the second option in the cover page layout. Once you're ready to print it, you can change the setting and start designing the spine. Check that everything is in order and click OK once you're satisfied. We're ready to start illustrating the comic, but before we do that, let's recap. In the last episode, we did a quick sketch on how I wanted our plans to look. I suppose that you did your homework and checked the previous episodes to serve as a guide for you to get started. I suppose. If you haven't checked them by now, go and come back and rethink your life choices. This is our blank page. Let's start by taking the rough idea that we formulated in the concept phase. In the second episode of The Legend Reborn, we want to make our readers explore more of Laura's personality and who she is. With the script and characters designs in hand, the penciling process can begin, and it's all a matter of connecting the pieces. This involves sketching out the basic layout and composition of each page, including panel placement and character positioning. I'm using a Human Canvas, which has program keys that improve my workflow. Fun fact, the original designs of the ethereals were all drawn by hand, using only the left button and trackpad of my old laptop. So not having a drawing tablet is not an excuse. There are some things that you might want to keep an eye on. On the top of your screen you'll see the main toolbar with different settings. Then we have on our left side our tools and color palette. On the upper right corner you can play with the scale and orientation settings. And on your lower right corner you will notice a different set of settings from the ones we've covered already. Here is where you'll see your folders and layers. Likewise, I'll be showing some of the buttons I use to make things easier to reach out without actually having to touch the tools on your left. These steps are what I call the concept panels, since their whole purpose is to serve as a guide of the actual panels. What we want to do now is draw the boxes of the comic, which are actually known as panels. You can draw a quick reference with your pen, which can be accessed by pressing P on your keyboard. If you mess something up, you can either undo the whole thing by pressing Ctrl C, or you can fix the mistake with your eraser, which can be accessed by pressing the E button. Okay, with the reference all done, let's position our character. This part may be tricky if you have no idea of how you want your comic to look. That is why I take a different approach, as I mentioned in the previous episode. Anyhow, you may want to check different videos of other creators who touch topics like character composition and anatomy. Or you can follow my route. You will end up developing your own workflow as you grow as a creator. What I feel best works for me is creating a panel that works at its own pace. After completing these steps, we want to materialize the actual panels and characters. I'm going to present you my next bodies, which are the box tools. There are a few settings and tricks you might want to understand first. By pressing U, you will access the frame border setting. Once you do that, on your upper left you will notice two different settings, which are create frame and cut frame border. You will mostly use the rectangle frame, but it is important to mention the other two. The polyline frame is used if you have a panel that has a particular line figure. The frame border pen is used if you have an odd figure you want to achieve and want to freehand draw it. You might want to toy with the settings of both of these, in particular the stabilization setting of the last one. Furthermore, you can change the thickness of your panel's border by choosing a different brush size. Also, when creating a panel, you can either do each individual panel or you can create a whole panel and slice it. Even if you don't create a whole panel, there might be some instances where you might want to slice your panel. To cut it, head to the other setting called Cut Frame Border. Now you will see two new subtools, which are Divide Frame Folder and Divide Frame Border. And just like before, choosing which tool to use depends on what you want to achieve. If you want to make a scene or panel that is independent from the other one, choose Divide Frame Folder. If you want to make a scene where you want to show two things happening at the same time, pick Divide Frame Border. When choosing Divide Frame Folder, this will automatically create its own folder, while selecting Divide Frame Border will have everything stored in the same folder. Holding down Shift while cutting a frame will give you a 45-degree angle. The last thing that I want to add to this process is that you can change the space in which Clip slices your panels by playing with the gutter settings. As a rule of thumb, you will want to keep both of these settings of the same sizes. The next step is to illustrate your character. Here is where you're going to take the character sheet and use it as a reference, since you want to keep a cohesive character with all of its different poses. You can also use the sketch drawing in the concept panels. Most illustrators draw using color pens like red, blue, and gray. Some prefer to go all black, but that's really up to you. What you want to do here is start working on the line art. You don't have to copy the way I do it, but feel free to use it as a guide. This is the style I have developed over the years, so I'm comfortable doing the line art this way. Nevertheless, it is important that you develop a style that you are comfortable with. Sometimes when I don't have the full idea of a panel, I start by drawing it in a red pen. If I know how I want my panel to look, I use a regular black pen, and afterwards I use the G pen to polish my line work. Although the rule of thumb is not to use a black pen in this step. Which takes me to inking. After the pencils are complete, it's time to start inking. This involves tracing over the pencil lines with ink to create the final artwork. Inking is a critical step in the comic book development process, as it helps to define the final line work and create contrast and depth in the artwork. This part of the episode is pretty simple on paper. But the research and process behind it is more complex since it involves understanding shadows, light sources, and color theory. There are plenty of other teachers who can teach you these steps, but not me. I'm not one of them. I'm just a guy making a comic book smoothie. Use your pen to start tracing your black ink over your reference line work. I'm not going to take much time covering this since it's pretty self-explanatory, but just for the sake of further elaborating this step, back in the day when we didn't have the tools to make a digital comic, inking was done by an inker. Don't get me wrong, we still have inkers, but the workflow is a bit different in the modern way of inking. In the traditional way, their duty involved tracing over the pencil lines done by the penciler, as well as interpreting the pencils, giving proper weight to the lines, correcting mistakes, and taking some creative liberties. In the modern way, the line work can be done directly on the illustration program, although in some cases it is common to draw a sketch on paper, scan the piece, and trace over it digitally. It is important to mention that depending on the art style, shading can be done in this process. In some cases, shading is done by using closely spaced parallel lines, feathering, or cross hatching, while other instances involve shading in deep black. After you're done and satisfied with the line work, it's time for you to take your brush out and start coloring. Once the inking process is complete, the next step is to add color to our artwork. This can be done either by hand or digitally, and it involves applying color to each panel and character in the comic book. If I didn't mention this before, in the traditional sense of creating a comic book, different departments are responsible of tying everything together and bringing it to life. Given that in our case, I'm mostly in charge of producing the comic, I tackle each process by myself. For instance, just like there's a department that is in charge of inking, there's usually a department for the coloring process. Like there are inkers for the former, there are colorists for the latter. And this, my fellow viewers, is the whole reason we decided to use Kickstarter to bring our comic to life. I've been doing illustration for at least 15 years. Most of which have been done as an amateur, but it's still experience nonetheless. Although I'm pretty much a self-taught natural, I never excel at creating backgrounds. Sure, I can perform the anatomical breakdown of a character, come up with unhinged shapes and make it look natural, give attention to details that make our characters feel realistic and create character compositions. I never got around designing background art. And I understand the shapes, forms and all the intricacies of a background composition, but I hate to admit this is my Achilles heel. And the reason why the production of our comic is slow. The funds raised during our campaign will go solely in commissioning the background illustrations for the scenes of our comic book. Which takes me to some of the frequently asked questions people have asked about the comic. No, just no. Look, I'm not 100% committed to AI art. If you're telling me that maybe you're going to use it as a guide to help you sketch out something, then maybe. And that's a hard maybe. Maybe. Art should be something that you want to express, something that people can feel. It has to be an emotion created from your work. Artificial intelligence can imitate the feeling, but it will never be able to replicate it. The style I'm looking for and what my goal is to make our backgrounds feel like they came straight out of an anime. I think I have discussed this a few times. I think. But the cost of doing that will be so expensive. Just the task of creating a campaign for less than 10k has been a challenge. I can't possibly comprehend how difficult it will be to create an animated series that would cost anywhere from 100 to 200k per episode. Maybe we're able to do a short 40-minute animated film? Maybe. We'll see. I was going to discuss this on a future episode, but I will briefly touch upon it here. The money raised will go towards the purchase of background art. About 70% of it goes towards the art, 10% goes towards fees, another 10% goes towards taxes, and the final 10% goes towards an emergency fund in case something goes wrong. I will absorb the printing costs out of my own savings. Well, the idea is not to only expand on the universe of Oblivion, but to fully explain on how our TCG works. This will be a fun way for us to introduce the card game to new audiences. Totally, our first episode is already out and you can read it by clicking on the link found in our description box. If you have a Kickstarter account, you can subscribe directly by clicking on the link. If you're new to the world of Kickstarter, you can subscribe to our newsletter where you can learn more about it and how to become a backer. We also have our online store if you want to purchase other goodies, and if you use our discount code, you can get 10% off of select items. The links to all this can be found in the description box. You can join our Discord server and jump into our lobby and meet other people. And with this, we have covered the third episode of the comic book series. In the next one, we'll review the lettering and editing and revision process. As always, I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you become part of our story. See you around.